Hello, everyone. AJ here. Welcome back to Art Isn't Easy. And we are continuing our 1960s series today by delving into 1963. So, when I think of 1963 for cinema, I've noticed a lot of film people that follow awards acknowledge how bad the 1963 Best Picture lineup was. I just want to read off these nominees here. So the nominees for Best Picture of 1963 were America, America, Cleopatra, How the West Was Won, Lilies of the Field, and our winner, Tom Jones. Tom Jones is still to this day one of the lowest rated Best Picture winners. And it's funny because I feel like when you look at the Oscars, there's always this reputation of them not wanting to honor genre films like comedies, sci-fi, action, horror. Although we're starting to see a little bit of a trickling in of horror lately. I feel like with comedy, it's almost like they always pick the wrong ones to focus on. And I don't really have anything nice to say about Tom Jones. Lilies of the Field is a decent film. It's mostly remembered as the film that netted Sidney Poitier his Oscar, becoming the first person of color to win in a leading acting category. But when I look at the best director category that year, there are three directors for their films who got the acknowledgement there. And then it makes you wonder, well, how did they not get into Best Picture? So, for example, you have Otto Preminger for The Cardinal, you have Federico Fellini for Eight and a Half, and then Martin Ritt for HUD. Not to spoil anything, but HUD, which not only got this director nomination, but ended up netting two acting wins that night, somehow did not get into Best Picture, even though it was, in my opinion, the best of the Hollywood films to come out that year by a mile. Like, this was a truly abysmal year for English language cinema, at least from a Hollywood standpoint. So, looking at this list, we have only a couple films that are in English, which is kind of par for the course for this point in the decade, I feel like. But our number 10 selection is going to be John Sturgis's The Great Escape. Now, when I think about The Great Escape, I remember as a kid watching The Simpsons, and there's that episode of Streetcar Named Marge where they enroll Maggie in the Ayn Rand School for Tots, which also is, you're never going to see The Simpsons do that anymore. It's some kind of satire like that. But the woman who's modeled after Ayn Rand, down to even reading a fictional Fountainhead diet book, locks away all the baby's pacifiers, which, of course, Maggie Simpson has the famous pacifier thing going on. So, in order to retrieve all the pacifiers, she goes through this whole bit, but there's this music in the background that I distinctly remembered. And when I first watched this film, I was like, oh, it's that music from The Simpsons. Once again, The Simpsons, major cultural touchstone for me. I feel like I learned everything from like entertainment, pop culture, and even just pop culture in general from The Simpsons. But The Great Escape is most known for being the Steve McQueen film where he's trying to escape from a POW camp during World War II. It also has that amazing motorcycle chase scene, which has to be one of the best stunts ever put on film. So, and there's also that great moment when you see like Steve McQueen in the grass and he's like kind of creeping up, and it's like, and then you just like imagine like him like coming up from under the ground, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna escape. I'm going to escape. Here I go. Ooh. Well, I guess there's nowhere to really go from here. I guess I'll just go back to the German PW camp. Okay. I failed. At number 9, we have a film I already alluded to, which is Martin Ritt's HUD. Paul Newman. I feel like Paul Newman is just, and I've said this before when I talked about The Hustler for 1961. Paul Newman is a very charismatic actor, or he was. Like, his energy that he always brought to roles was second to none. And I do feel like this is one of his better performances. He plays such a sniveling cad. But also, I have to call out Patricia Neal. So, Patricia Neal won Best Actress that year. but she's only in roughly 25 minutes of the film. So arguably she has supporting screen time, even if she's the de facto female lead. But this is a prime example of a performance where her screen presence and what she contributes to the plot is so integral that it's hard to really ignore her. Like, this is a very lived in performance. It kind of reminds me a little bit of, and this is an odd comparison at first glance, but Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs. I kid you not, like, I often recognize screen time, but when I first saw Silence of the Lambs, I just accepted that he was a lead. And then when someone told me that he was only in like 17 to 20 minutes of the film, I was like, wait, how is that even possible? But that's how much of an effect he had on the film. And I would argue Patricia Neal had the same thing for HUD, which is like such a great story about like fathers and sons and like competition between women. And you also have Brandon DeWild in it, who is most well known for Shane. There's also an interesting story going around that Paul Newman and Brandon DeWild had like a gay affair, which, look that up. If that is true, it sounds very sexy. But, anyways, we're going to go on to number 8, to the world of Harold Pinter, who scripted Joseph Losey's film The Servant. I think that Pinter he's someone that gets a bad rap. You could argue it's a bad rap. I don't think you really hear as much about him. His plays used to get revived a decent amount, but you don't really see it happening anymore. When I first moved to New York, I remember seeing Betrayal and Old Times getting revived, but like I wouldn't mind seeing something like The Homecoming or The Birthday Party revived. But The Servant is almost like a Parasite type film, and that a man hires this person to be his servant. So it's the man's Tony, and he hires Hugo to be his servant. But Hugo then asks Tony, it's almost like in Parasite when you have like the son who then gets his sister a job, and then in turn gets the father a job, and then the mother, and then just like snowballs from there. So like there are those elements that you can see clearly piecing in whatever ended up becoming very big with Parasite. And there is a character, Tony's girlfriend Wendy does have suspicion over the situation. It's definitely very Pinter in style. It's very dark, it's very shadowy. I have said this before, but I do want to say it again, that I had a coworker years ago who claimed that British filmmakers never actually made good films. And for some reason, that always registered as like correct, but he couldn't have been more wrong. In fact, I would argue that a lot of these British films from this time period, while not necessarily perfect, were still far more interesting than like most of the output that we were given. We are going to move on to number 7, and we have Satyajit Ray's The Big City. Now, Ray is a director that I have only seen a few of his films, which is a shame because I do feel like he is a highly regarded director who I should delve more into. Like, I've seen the Apu trilogy, I've seen Charlotta, I've seen Big City. I think what makes Big City a fascinating film for its time and also a slight change of pace from the Apu trilogy is that we get a female protagonist, and she is a woman who is feeling very cramped and stifled by the life she is leading and wants to become a woman of the workforce. And she gets a job as a salesperson. And I do appreciate films from this time starting to slowly creep that in. It's sort of like with Ozu's films in Japan, where he always tackled the patriarchy. And you sort of see Ray doing that here as well. And also, I mentioned Charlotta earlier, and spoiler alert, that's coming up in 1964, which is another great example of Ray pushing the envelope for standards that were often held in Indian culture at that time. Now, at number 6, we have Luchino Visconti's The Leopard. The Leopard has had a very interesting history in that when it was first released over here, there were so many edits made to the film that a lot of people dubbed it a disaster. And in recent years, it's gotten seen by wider audiences in its original cut, and it is more successful that way. We have Burt Lancaster in this film playing an aging prince who's also dealing with his opportunist nephew who's trying to climb up the social ladder. And in a way, it kind of has that element, kind of reminds me of Barry Lyndon a little bit. And the film does have that Barry Lyndon vibe of like the gorgeous, like every shot's practically a painting kind of thing. But I think The Leopard is one that I would like to revisit sometime soon because a lot of it I am just kind of basing off of memory from having seen it before. And sometimes I will admit I go into these films and wonder if when I'm talking about them, if maybe I would actually rethink them if I were to revisit them. So consider this just a snapshot for the moment. Now, at number five, we have Louis Malle's The Fire Within. And I am very much a fan of Louis Malle. I did talk about him in 1960 for Zazie dans la Metro. Fire Within, I feel like doesn't get as talked about as much. And I would say that it's probably my favorite film from this portion of his career. Like, I would say it's better than Elevator to the Gallows. I do like it more than Zazie, although Zazie I think is a little more visually fascinating. Like, I love the energy of that one. But this one is about a man named Alain, played by Maurice Ronet, who is in France. His wife is American, but she has returned to America while he is currently in a rehabilitation center for alcoholism. And while he does get out of this facility, he goes on a bit of an odyssey to try to make connections with people, particularly casual ones with women, now that his wife is not immediately around. And it's basically just him trying to find solace and comfort from the life that he lost, that it's so it seems that he may not be able to get back. So there is that sense of regret. I also see it as something of a precursor to Joachim Trier's Oslo, August 31st, which is another great film from him if you haven't seen it. But I will say one thing about Fire Within is there is a line from it where the lead character says, "I am going to kill myself tomorrow," which is, I mean, it's a very blunt line, but that line was actually an inspiration to Wes Anderson. In The Royal Tenenbaums, the character of Richie, played by Luke Wilson, says it. So I do find it hilarious sometimes when like films that you least expect are inspired by other films collide like this, because I would have never have thought that The Fire Within had any sort of inspiration towards the work of Wes Anderson. But stranger things have happened. But we are now going to move on to a very underrated film in the Ingmar Bergman canon. And this would be at number four, The Silence. When it comes to films that just scream, "Oh, that's Ingmar," The Silence is one that really captures a lot of the aesthetic that made Bergman Bergman. The shadows and the lighting, the facial compositions. Like there's a great shot of like the two sisters in this, where like where she's like looking at her, and then she's like the whole parallel thing going on. I mean, and obviously a lot of filmmakers, particularly Woody Allen, I think of the ending of Love and Death, where he mimics that kind of like facial thing with like Diane Keaton. But I do think that Bergman was somehow able to make this work because his films were just so emotionally vast. So The Silence stars Ingrid Thulin and Gunnar Lindblom, and they play two sisters named Esther and Anna. And they are traveling by train with Anna's 10-year-old son, Johann. But while they're going through the fictional Central European country of Tomoka, that country ends up falling into war, which creates a little bit of extra chaos around them. Now, one element of this that is very Bergman that we also tapped on in Through a Glass Darkly back in 61 is that there is a weird relationship between these two sisters. Some have speculated, do Esther and Anna have a relationship? And by relationship, I mean incest. I mean, I definitely could buy that argument. There is a weird energy between them, but also you have the young boy, Johann. You have Esther, who is his aunt, trying to bond with him, and she's like caressing his face and hair, and it's just like, and he's like feeling weird about it, but it's like, what is going on with these people? And it's just, I'm not saying it's his absolute best work by any means, but I do think The Silence is one of his more underrated. And for the record, so is this next one, because at number three, we have yet another Bergman film, which completes his de facto Faith trilogy, and that is Winter Light. I used to say I preferred The Silence, but I do feel like Winter Light is a smidge better. And I also would say it's underrated. And I think why it's has sustained with me more over time is because I do love a good crisis of faith story, because I grew up really in a crisis of faith, because the church I grew up in was very toxic. I I mean, I forget if I've really gone into this, but long story short, I was in a position where a woman, like old enough to be my mother, in fact, probably even older than that, told me to my face as a 7-year-old that I would be sent to hell if Jesus were to come back the next day, because I had not been baptized and I had not spoken in tongues, because I was raised apostolic, which is sort of like an evangelical Pentecostal type thing. Not cool. I lived in a lot of fear as a child, and film was a major reason that I got so sucked in, because it was a way to escape from that fear. Because most of my childhood, like when Y2K happened, I was literally expecting the world to just end. It wasn't just technology. Like, my church made it seem like Jesus was coming back. It's the second coming. Hallelujah. But Winter Light delves into the story of a priest, and is played by Gunnar Bjornstrand. And then he gives advice to this fisherman named Jonas, who's actually played by the perennial Bergman favorite Max von Sydow. But Jonas is living in fear about China developing an atomic bomb. But when the pastor tries to give him advice, it leads to Jonas killing himself. And therefore, it becomes this thing of like, well, why, if there is a God, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? Which is a theme that Woody Allen often tried to use. I always think about Hannah and her sisters. There's like a big speech where he's talking about that to his parents. I just feel like Bergman, despite his faults, like on a personal level, I do admire what he tried to tackle at a time when most filmmakers wouldn't even dare. I do love the idea of a crisis of faith. And yes, that might not be as scandalous as potential incest between sisters. We're going to move on to number two. And this is a crown jewel of the great Akira Kurosawa's career. And that is the definitive detective procedural film High and Low. I say definitive. I'm not necessarily saying that it is the best, but in many ways, this film set the true groundwork for what a great detective procedural should be. Now, High and Low, you might be thinking of recently, Spike Lee did a remake called Highest to Lowest, where he had Denzel Washington playing this music mogul. I'll admit it, I have not seen it. I heard that it wasn't that great, so I can't speak to that film. High and Low is set in modern day Tokyo. It takes Kurosawa away from the samurai elements that he was very like involved with during the 50s. But you have a businessman who is played by the other perennial Kurosawa favorite, Toshiro Mifune. He is a board member for a shoe company, and he wants to have more power within that company. So he intends to use leverage by trying to buy out the company with his life savings. But in the process, someone actually abducts his son, Jun, and wants a ransom for him to come back, particularly 30 million yen. But then, as he starts to go through this process, Jun comes home. It turns out that the kidnappers accidentally abducted their chauffeur's son. So now you have like this completely innocent. So, I mean, not that obviously June would be innocent too, but just someone else like this poor chauffeur's son is kidnapped, and it ends up leading to a very tense ending. This is a film I actually would like to revisit this one too. I feel like the more I think about High and Low, the more I do think it could be Kurosawa's best. It's just there's something there. Like it truly is a definitive example of how to make a great detective procedural film. Now we arrive at number one, and this is a film that I did mention earlier, but we have the masterpiece, the magnum opus of the great Federico Fellini, and that is Eight and a Half. I do think that Eight and a Half is so. I'm going to talk a little bit about Nine for a moment. Anyone who's into musical theater probably knows the musical Nine. So composer Maury Yeston conceived of developing Eight and a Half into a musical, and then the way that he justified the number nine was that the extra half was the music element. Nine did change a lot from the film. Like, for example, most basically every male character aside from Guido is gone. Well, we get young Guido, but everyone else is played by a woman. So it's like Guido in the original production. Guido is played by Raul Julia, who was such a fantastic actor. Like I always think of him as Gomez in the Addams Family, but that's because I'm a semi-elder millennial. And but anyways, I'm getting very off track here. Fellini has made some truly magnificent films. He had La Strada, La Dolce Vita, there's Knights of Cabiria, but Eight and a Half, as cliche as it might be to say, is his best film. And Guido is a filmmaker in midlife crisis. He's married to his wife, Luisa, but he also has a mistress on the side named Carla, but he also has this actress who is his muse named Claudia. But he's trying to end his fling with her because he's more obsessed with Carla. And he gets away to this retreat because his career is kind of on a slump. His creative energies are kind of floundering, and he's trying to make this very avant-garde sci-fi film, and it's not going well for him. And he's having all these like weird visions and keeps thinking back to his childhood when he was very enveloped by the love of the women in his life, like his mom, his aunts. And it's like he wants to have that like warm mother. It's like he's seeking like the approval of like all these women in his life. And then there's the moment when young Guido encounters a prostitute on the beach who kind of accosts him, and then that basically sends his mother into disarray. I feel like when I first saw Eight and a Half, I'm not saying I understood all of it. I'm not even saying I necessarily understand all of it now, but there was something so fetching about it, like so dreamy, so alluring, just like so uniquely what made Fellini Fellini. I always use the word sumptuous to describe Fellini's work, particularly like stuff that he made post La Strada, because even in like some of his bleakest films, there's just this energy, this like bubbling energy to his work. And I do feel like after Eight and a Half, his career doesn't truly take off again. Like he doesn't make like a true masterpiece, so to speak. I mean, you have Juliet of the Spirits, which I do like, but I wouldn't say I love. He does have one more film, Amacor, which comes out in the 70s that is great. I do consider that his last great film. But Eight and a Half is his magnum opus. I do think it's a fantastic film. But with that, we come to an end for 1963. Now, I already alluded to in my last video that 1964 would be epic. 1964 is one of my favorite years for film ever. How so? Of the top 10, 9 of the films get 5 stars from me. I can't think of many other years where that many films get 5 stars from me. And I'm going to be naming 20 films in that video. I'm going to try to keep it brief. And I can't wait to talk about that one because it's honestly the year that I've been most pressed to get to. But I didn't want to skip, I want to like go in chronological order. So with that in mind, we are going to end this here, and I will see you all soon with 1964. So, au revoir.